Good morning, friends, and welcome to Wake Up in the Word for a Wednesday, right in the middle of the week, and doing all kinds of storms, like we had one last night here with some hail in Chesney, South Carolina. Hope you're okay wherever you are. Let's grab a good cup of coffee or something else and get over the scriptures. John chapter 18. We left Jesus last night with the enemy. The folks that have just arrested him, and they're hauling him off to trial. It's about 1:30 in the morning, and things are not looking good for the Son of God. But as we noted from even the arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus Christ is really in control in this situation. Now in John chapter 18, verse 12, we read that the company of soldiers, the commander, and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus and tied him up. And first they led him to Annas, since he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. We'll explain all that in just a little bit. Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jews that it would be better for one man to die for the people. Well, now with that thought in mind, let's get the background on this passage so that you can understand it better. McAllister helps us understand it by talking about the trials, plural, of Jesus. Now, for many of us who've grown up knowing about Jesus, we got to this point in the drama and said, well, yeah, there were a couple of trials, right? Maybe the one before the Jews and the one before Pilate. No, if you add them up properly and the back and forth, much more than that. Matter of fact, McAllister points out that he was taken through 6 separate trials on his way to the cross. Many people don't realize on the night before his crucifixion, he was subject to 3 religious and 3 civil trials. The religious trials took place before this particular person that's been named by John, Annas, before the Supreme Court of Israel, then culminated with a religious sentencing about 5 o'clock that morning. Then came, of course, the civil trials, first before Pilate, then before Herod, and then back to Pilate. Every one of these trials, he writes, was a sham, a lie, and a ripoff. They made an absolute mockery of law and justice. But Jesus knew this was coming when he said, "This is your hour and the power of darkness." Now, this is nothing new. We've seen how corrupt people in control can use their so-called law system to bring down the whirlwind on whoever they choose to persecute. We've seen what lawfare can do even in the United States of America, where you're supposed to be guaranteed a fair trial. And that isn't always the case now, is it? Well, Jesus Christ understands injustice more than anyone. And if you have felt it, if you've been a part of it, and you know the pain and the suffering that goes with it, there's one you can call on and pray to that understands it clearly. His name is Jesus Christ. Now let's look at what happens next. We see that cohort of soldiers and the chief captain and the officers of the Jews took and bound Jesus, led him away, first to Annas. And why are they taking him to him? Because Caiaphas is the high priest. We'll find out here in just a minute. We've got to explore the character of this guy named Annas. And as you know, the Romans of that day actually ruled over Israel, very much like, any conquering power rules over a tiny country that it's subjected to its rule. For many reasons, the Jews were difficult for the Romans to control. It's kind of obvious there, isn't it? They seem to have a little bit of a rebellious nature when it comes to this foreign power. But here's what the Romans did to help with that. They said to the Jewish people, okay, we'll allow your leaders to rule over you, the high priest and his family and the Supreme Court and the Pharisees and the Sadducees, if they'll all play our game. We're still over you. We'll allow your leaders to have some local control, though. So this particular man, Annas, had been the high priest for many, many years. He was an older gentleman at this point, who knows how old exactly. But finally, the Romans had come to him and said, look, Annas, we really like you, but it's now time for you to step down. Do you have any sons? Annas said, well, certainly I do. So the Romans said, hey, pick one to be the ruling high priest. They liked Annas because he played their game and he played it well. So there's a succession of sons of Annas that have been the high priests. Do you see what's happening here? The bureaucracy and the religious system of Judaism at the time was really being controlled subversively by the Romans, who were able to pick the high priest and keep things in control. That's how it has worked. Well, since you have to have successive high priests, what do you have to do? Well, you have to work through these sons of this current high priest. Just keep it in-house here. Let's keep things under control. And they really liked him, and he worked through a succession of 5 sons who all successively served as high priest. But then years later, when the Romans came and asked is there another son that can serve now, because you can't serve as high priest forever. Well, at this point, he says, well, no, I don't have any more sons that can serve as high priest. But guess what? I've got a son-in-law. I did have a daughter, married a guy named Caiaphas, who's a great priest. So he's still keeping it under his rule. Well, so Caiaphas was the ruling high priest during the time of Christ. Actually, he was just a token high priest. The power behind it all was Annas, something both the Romans and the Jews knew to be true. Now, here's something else about him that you've got to understand. They were insanely rich. Do you know why? They were big-time crooks, McAllister tells us. For example, when someone went to the temple to sacrifice a lamb, the officials would say, hey, wait a minute, you can't just bring any old lamb in here. You need a temple-approved lamb. And of course, temple-approved lambs came at a high cost. And of course, when you get the other issue that you had to deal with, paying of the temple tax, it gave them a chance to make even more money. He says that Annas and the temple officials ran this money-changing operation within the temple grounds. They would demand a special currency, then sell it at an inflated rate of exchange. It was just shameless robbery. This is why Jesus, not too many days before his arrest, had walked into the temple and, of course, did some house cleaning. He took out a whip, made a little woven cord, and drove the animals out of the temple, turned over the money changers' tables, and he said, folks, my Father's house will not be a den of thieves. And of course, who's paying attention to all this? The high priest. Now you're getting into his back pocket, aren't you? Well, it appears Jesus had been getting under Anna's skin for a while. He didn't like the fact that Jesus was popular with the people. It made him and the other religious leaders look bad. And now that Jesus has disrupted the money-changing scheme in the temple, he had hit Annas right where it hurt him the most, in his wallet. For these reasons, Annas was thrilled to have Jesus brought his way in the middle of the night. He's dressed and ready for the occasion. You notice that? Yeah, he knew that he needed to move fast while the people of Jerusalem were still asleep. Every Jew and his brother was there for the Passover, and he couldn't afford a religious riot on his hands. His goal was to see Jesus convicted of an offense, any offense, that would convince Pilate that Jesus was worthy of death. And with luck, he could have Jesus Christ crucified before the crowds knew what was happening. But if he woke up to find Jesus in Annas' custody, it wouldn't be a pretty sight. So he needed some things to happen, and happen quickly. Now, to understand what's happening, let's examine some things about Jewish law. First, a person was not obligated to incriminate himself. It's very much like our own Fifth Amendment. After a person was charged with the crime, the accusers would present their case, and then the defenders, and finally a bunch of lawyers would try to figure out who was lying. Never did the accused have to speak unless he chose to. And the first trial that evening, every basic rule of Jewish law was broken. No charges were read, no witnesses were allowed, no evidence was presented. Instead, Annas began his interrogation of Jesus. In fact, the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. We hear all about this later in John chapter 18. In essence, Jesus, tell us how you have perverted your followers with your teaching. He was trying to get Jesus to admit that he taught for the purpose of a revolution, for the overthrow of the Roman Empire. And by doing this, he was totally out of order, legally speaking. His goal was to get Jesus to speak and thus incriminate himself, so he was way out of bounds. It making sense then that Jesus would reply the way that he did by saying, look, I spoke openly to the world. I always taught in the synagogues, in the temple where the Jews assemble. I said nothing in secret. Why do you question me? Question those who heard me. They know what I said. Well, by saying this, Jesus was calling Annas to order. But his display of calm authority and directness angered one of the temple guards. And when he said this, one of the officers standing nearby even struck Jesus in the face. Is this the way you answer the high priest? He demanded. So this drama continues, and we're going to see it as we go not only from this sham trial, but to the next one tomorrow when we have a little more time. Oh my goodness, it gets even deeper here as we see every official willing to violate their own rules and regulations just so they can crucify Jesus. It's a somber way to leave you on this Wednesday, but you know the end of the story. God bless you. I'll see you again in the morning when we wake up in the Word and see the next steps.